Inside of the concentration camps, there were many guards who became notorious for their use of violence and brutality upon vulnerable prisoners. Guards such as Irma Grazer became infamous for her use of the whip, and also encouraging her dog to attack inmates at camps such as Auschwitz, Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen. To carry out their murderous intent of the Holocaust, the Nazis scared millions of people into submission, and many thought that the gas chambers was their way out from the hellish ordeal within the barbed wire fences they were subjected to. There were many guards who after the Second World War were never brought to justice, and managed to escape and live a very quiet life, with their crimes pushed to the backs of their minds. There were a small percentage of former SS members of staff who were executed following war crimes trials, but many were sentenced to long prison sentences. Today we look at a man who, despite being relatively small in his stature, was a horrifically savage guard who inflicted such misery onto the prisoners at sites such as Dachau. Join us today as we look at the disgusting crimes of Egon Zill. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Egon Zill was born in Plauen on the 28th of March 1906, and his father was a brewer. But his father was seriously injured as he fought during the First World War, and because of this, Egon Zill then had to become an apprentice baker very early in his life to bring money into his family, and he became the breadwinner at a young age. But at the age of 17, he then enlisted in the Nazi Party, and he joined the SA, Hitler's Brown Shirts. He was attracted to the politics of the Nazis and Hitler, but then when the SS came to his hometown, he joined up, and was SS member number 535, meaning he signed up incredibly early on. Before the Second World War broke out, he worked as a security guard inside of a curtain-making factory. In 1934 he became a full-time SS man at the age of 28, and then he served inside the concentration camps. Egon Zill was sent to Chemnitz concentration camp, where he first served as a guard, and this was the first position he obtained within the horrific system. He would rise throughout the different ranks at times, and he was then sent to Lichtenburg concentration camp, which was considered one of the earliest sites opened by the Nazis. This complex held up to 2,000 prisoners at a time, and it became incredibly overcrowded inside of the rundown castle where the camp was based. But it was later transferred to become a women's only camp before Ravensbrück opened up. Zill then worked between many different sites, and he would see work at Dachau, Ravensbrück and Hinzert in a number of different roles. But whilst at Dachau, he became infamous for his role in the cruelty and brutality of the concentration camps. He was described as, having received his Death's Head unit's training in Dachau, he was familiar with all the terrors that the camp had to offer its inmates. Egon Zill became one of the most sadistic commandants in the history of the concentration camps. Not only did he devise new organised methods of torture for the unfortunate prisoners, he took great joy in taking part in punishment personally, or else watching from the sidelines as the prisoners died at the hands of the equally sadistic guards. Zill thrived on watching men beaten, drowned, hung, and broken until their bodies were unrecognisable masses of bone and skin. A tag attached to their toes listed an identification number so they could be properly recorded in the record books as having died from a heart attack or some other medical ailment. One former prisoner of Dachau would state after the war that Egon Zill had his dogs trained to react to the raising of an arm. On special amusement days, Zill would have a table of food placed in front of the starving prisoner who stood to attention. Should a person relax his body, the dogs would react automatically. As time went by and Zill became impatient, he raised his arms signalling the dogs into action. They attacked the genital area of the prisoners until they were dead. At this point the bored commandant would leave the scene, having the prisoners sing anti-Semitic songs as they dug pits to be filled with stones, only to have the stones dug up and used to fill other pits was a common pastime for the guards. At other times, they would bind the prisoners' hands and feet and have them crawl on the ground, grunting like pigs. As the prisoners approached the pigsty, food was put out for their meal to be eaten by the pigs. The SS men stood watching as the bound prisoners fought with the pigs for the food. This type of torture was used with Jews, priests, Jehovah's Witnesses and Poles. Inside of Dachau, there was a bunker reserved for torture. Many prisoners were kept in solitary confinement, but tortures such as the standing cell were cruel, and Zill used these. But then Egon Zill transitioned to become the Commandant of Natzweiler-Struthof, before he then took charge at Flossenburg. At both of these sites, dozens of thousands of people would be killed. At Flossenburg, around 90,000 prisoners passed through the gates, but around 30,000 would die from malnutrition, execution, death marches, and the brutal work they had to do. When Zill was there, he oversaw many deaths, and prisoners were forced to work inside of the quarries very hard, where the death rate was higher due to the demanding work. There were other factories based there, but Zill made many of the prisoner functionaries such as Carpos corrupt, and he forced them to be brutal towards other prisoners. Many of the inmates would be beaten to death, and the prisoners were often mistreated, being covered with cold water in freezing weather, leading to hypothermia, and many were shot by the guards indiscriminately. There were large numbers of executions carried out there during Zill's time, in which many were shot dead. There was a crematorium established to deal with the large amount of dead bodies, and following an evening in the camp's jail, many were executed on the firing range. Also, lethal injection was used at times because, shockingly, the local residents complained that in nearby rivers they were flowing with blood and body parts were washing up there. At Natzweiler-Struthof, another camp where he served, 52,000 people were imprisoned, with over 22,000 dying there. The work the prisoners had to do was very strenuous, and work, hunger, and a lack of healthcare led to many deaths. Disease would spread around the camp, and there was a gas chamber that executed selected prisoners. Egon Zill continued to be incredibly brutal, and as a commandant he expected his guards to act with discipline and violence, and he believed that those who worked there should be the strongest Nazis, but he also believed that some prisoners could be brainwashed inside of his camp to become Nazis and then turned over to be part of the war effort. His regime was one which was considered incredibly cruel, and prisoners would state he committed many crimes. As mentioned, some of his most shocking crimes included using his dog to attack prisoners who were tied to trees. He was judged though to not have been an effective commandant, and his sacking came after villagers complained that the camp guards were living in excellent conditions compared to the locals inside the nearby village. He had created a culture of corruption within the guards, and following his sacking he was transferred to become a soldier on the Eastern Front. At his evaluation as a commandant it was said he had a strident personality, and was a long-time talented SS officer, but he did suffer from a lack of schooling in a military capacity, and he struggled with the small details. He was physically well suited for the demands of the work, and made quick decisions, but he has had no chance to prove himself at the front. He wanted to work on his shortcomings in the military abilities, but he was not strong enough to become a significant member of the military. But he was a brutal and barbaric war criminal, and he became known as Little Zill for his short size, but after the war had come to an end, he went underground and tried to avoid any form of justice. But he did slip up when on the birth certificate of an illegitimate child he wrote his real name by accident, and then following this he was arrested. He was brought to trial, and if he had been tried earlier, it was most probable that he would have been executed and killed, as in the decade after the war, German courts swayed towards prison sentences rather than a one-way trip to the gallows for war criminals. Egon Zill was sentenced to life imprisonment by a Munich court, but then he appealed, and his sentence was reduced to 15 years. But then after his release, shockingly Zill would return to one area where he inflicted such suffering. For some reason after his release he returned to Dachau, in the area near to the concentration camp where he worked, and he settled there for a number of years, until he died in 1974. Egon Zill was an SS concentration camp guard and commandant who is not the most well known, but he is remembered for being a brutal and horrific member of staff that served at many sites, a couple as a commandant. He was a terrifying man who would encourage his dogs to attack prisoners, and would also force many people to their deaths by the conditions inside of places where he worked. He was a man who, if brought to trial earlier, would probably have been executed, but ultimately he would spend some time in prison for his actions. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.